Welcome to The Inside Story. I'm Billy Hollowell, and today we are talking all about religious freedom, religious liberty. I'm joined by Ryan Foley of the Christian Post. How you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for coming on. You have had a very busy week. You were at the International Religious Freedom Summit. And for those who don't know much about that event, can you tell us what it is exactly?
Well, the International Religious Freedom Summit is a civil society-led event that raises awareness about international religious freedom. It includes panel discussions and speeches from members of Congress, religious freedom advocates, and survivors of religious persecution. This was the fourth time the event took place as a project of civil society led by former Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom Sam Brownback. But during the Trump administration, the U.S. State Department put on a similar event.
So this is something, obviously, religious liberty. It's something we talk about in a Western sense and an American sense. Many people here in this country are aware of the debates and the discussions we have here. But when we're talking international, some of these issues are sweeping and massive. And this is probably a loaded question, but what was the overarching assessment of the current state of affairs internationally when it comes to religious liberty?
Well, overall, there's a lot of areas of concern, particularly in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. However, there are concerns raised about the treatment of religious people in Western democracies as well, specifically when it comes to hate speech laws being used to go after members of parliament for stating the biblical positions about sexuality, as happened with Pavi Räsänen in Finland. There was a series of breakout sessions focused on religious liberty victories, but for the most part, the conference focused on areas where improvement is needed.
Yeah, and I mean, we've seen some of these reports from Open Doors USA, the World Watch List, showing some of the regions you just mentioned where there are severe issues, deadly persecution. But you also have, as you mentioned with Pavi Räsänen in Finland, the idea that somebody could tweet a Bible verse, a government official, and because they've tweeted that Bible verse and because it goes against popular cultural newfound norms, that they could find themselves in court and potentially facing jail time in a Western country, in any country, but especially in a Western country, is troubling. So you have different levels and layers of persecution unfolding. Nigeria obviously has become an increasing area of concern. And I know that there were speakers who addressed it specifically, and I mean, the persecution we're seeing rise there, particularly after early 2022 when there was a stoning there. It's been very concerning. What is going on in Nigeria, and what did the speakers at the International Religious Freedom Summit have to say about it?
Well, Father Ambrose Ekereku, I don't know if I pronounced that right, but he's a Catholic priest from Nigeria, characterized what's going on in Nigeria as a systematic jihad, genocide, and ethnic cleansing against Christians, where the Fulani ethnic group is targeting Christians in religiously motivated attacks that lead to Nigerian Christians being kidnapped, raped, maimed, and butchered. Churches and Christian villages have also found themselves bombed and destroyed.
Wow. Yeah, it's incredibly troubling for the Christians there. And it's something that I think we're going to hear a lot more about. What are some of the proposed ways that that particular priest and others, the things that they said might actually help curb some of the rising persecution in Nigeria?
Well, the most common solution offered up to deal with the situation in Nigeria is to designate Nigeria as a country of particular concern, which is reserved for the world's worst persecutors of religious freedom. It's been off the list, which is put together by the State Department for a few years now. And Father Ekureku went a step further by calling for the designation of Nigeria as a terrorist government because of its lack of actions to address what's going on there.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of pressure on the U.S. State Department to obviously indicate that Nigeria is a country of particular concern, and so that has not happened. It did happen under the Trump administration for 1 year, and then the Biden administration backtracked on it and removed Nigeria. So lots of conversation there. But one of the really interesting pieces of the International Religious Freedom Summit was that U.S. House of Representatives Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson addressed the gathering, and he spoke about another issue in China, the Uyghur minority population there and what they are facing. What did he have to say?
Well, he talked about how the Uyghurs are finding themselves subject to forced sterilization, forced detention, and re education, as well as forced labor, and he called on the Biden administration to take stronger action to implement the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which is designed to prevent goods made by Uyghurs imprisoned in slave labor from entering the U.S. market. So that law was passed unanimously by the Senate in 2021, and then the House almost unanimously passed it. So it has wide bipartisan approval, and Biden signed it, but I guess according to Speaker Johnson, he's not doing enough to enforce it.
Yeah, and that obviously, I mean, there's so many fires to be putting out on this front, right? I mean, we talk a lot about Christian persecution. The Uyghur Muslims, what's going on with them in the camps in China is incredibly troubling, and so very interesting to hear Speaker Johnson address that. There were some other comments that I found particularly intriguing and curious for a variety of reasons. But Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz, she had some intriguing comments about religion and discrimination that I think we should probably mention. What did she say during the International Religious Freedom Summit?
Well, Wasserman Schultz, who was the former chair of the Democratic National Committee, and then she still represents Florida in Congress, and she served as the honorary co chair of this year's summit, said that religion must not be used as a cudgel to discriminate against others. She talked about how many have sought to impose their beliefs on others or abuse religious freedoms to justify oppression or prejudice against religious minorities and other marginalized groups, including LGBTQI plus individuals.
Yeah, it's interesting because here we are, we just talked about Pavi Razinen, right? And what happened there. And we have some of these issues happening here. And we've seen repeatedly, I mean, Coach Joe Kennedy, the football coach who went to the Supreme Court to gain the right to pray on the 50-yard line. You've got bakers across the country who some of those cases have made their way to the Supreme Court, and there are others working their way through the courts. You had another recent Supreme Court case dealing with a graphic designer and same-sex weddings. Her comments were interesting to me in that she seemed to be speaking about an issue, really a contention between the First and the 14th Amendment that we see continuing to unfold in America when it comes to religious liberty. And I don't know, it was just curious. And what do you think she meant with those comments?
Well, she didn't really go into detail, but she was likely talking about what you kind of hinted at there, like Christian bakers such as Jack Phillips have declined to make cakes celebrating same sex weddings and gender transitions because doing so would violate his deeply held religious beliefs about marriage and sexuality. While the United States Supreme Court has ruled in favor of Phillips, and more recently, as you also mentioned, Christian website designer Laurie Smith, who declined to make websites for same sex weddings, Democrats find themselves on the other side of this debate as they support measures forbidding discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity that land these Christian business owners in court in the first place, as both Jack Phillips and Laurie Smith are from Colorado, so it's a state law banning discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, and then the Colorado Civil Rights Commission's enforcement of that lands them in court in the first place. And Democrats seem to think that protecting against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity trumps any religious liberty concerns.
Yeah, I mean, that that's an issue. And I think it's going to be a continued issue when it comes to this, because that in the West right now, that's the form of religious liberty discrimination, or rather infractions on religious liberty that a lot of Christians are concerned about. And so you have somebody there on the stage who's involved in this event who is actually almost advocating for that. So I think this is going to be a fierce issue as we move forward, because those Christian bakers and printers, they don't see it as discrimination. They see it as exercising their religious rights in their business, right? So it's going to be, again, a continued issue that we'll see unfold. Were there any other notable moments from the event that you feel are worth talking about?
Well, I did an interview on the side, not necessarily part of the event, but I guess he did give a speech at a kickoff dinner that took place Monday night before most of the event started. A guy who is a Hungarian government official who works for an office dedicated to helping persecuted Christians and other faith minorities around the world. I talked to him for an article that just got published on the Christian Post, and then he talked about that effort to help persecuted Christians and religious minorities that is spearheaded by the Hungarian government. And he also talked about how the pro family policies implemented by the country have raised the fertility rate slightly, not quite as much as he would hope, but it's basically incentivizing people to have children by enabling women to get out of having to pay income taxes if they have four or more children. And that's led to an increase in the marriage rate and a decrease in the abortion rate. So he was there to talk about how religious freedom is kind of a big deal in Hungary because they were under communist oppression and Nazi oppression for quite some time. So in their newly implemented constitution, they put Christianity and religious freedom on a pedestal because for so long they found themselves under communist and Nazi rule. So that was an interesting discussion, I thought, and he was honored that Hungary got to host the dinner on Monday. The Hungarian embassy hosted it. So that's an interesting discussion that I had off to the side.
Yeah, well, that sounds very interesting, and people can read all of these stories and see all of your great coverage over at the Christian Post. Ryan, as always, appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Everyone else, make sure you tune in next week for another episode of The Inside Story. In the meantime, head over to the Christian Post for the daily news you need to read. We'll see you again next week.